Today, we're going to be discussing the opposition to slavery in America in the period of the early to mid 19th century before the Civil War. And we're going to be focusing on a number of different things. First of all, we're going to be talking about the development or the emergence of abolition. In the early stages of the opposition to slavery, Americans tended to support emancipation, that is, the gradual freeing of slaves over time. But by the time we get to about 1830, opponents of slavery came to embrace abolition, the idea that slavery ought to be completely abolished and eliminated very quickly. So opposition to slavery became very radicalized by the time you get to the mid-19th century. Another development we're going to be discussing is the birth of the women's rights movement. And these two historical developments are very closely related, as we'll see, and as many of the opponents to slavery also became advocates for equal rights for women. So we're going to be exploring and examining the links between the development of the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. And finally, for our third topic, we're going to be discussing Uncle Tom's Cabin, its historical impact. Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, was written by a woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was also an abolitionist. So it links the two previous subjects, the issue of women's rights and abolition. And this book was very inflammatory, and this book very much influenced public opinion in both the North and the South, and it is often cited as a historical event, its publication as an historical event that led to the American Civil War. That will be our final subject that we'll discuss today. So let's begin by talking about emancipation, because in the earliest days of opposition to slavery, the consensus was that if slavery was to be banned from America, that it had to be done slowly through the gradual emancipation of slaves, willingly and voluntarily by their owners. The first widespread opposition to slavery in America really began with the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence declares that all men are created equal, and this sentiment was felt very strongly throughout the country. And as a result, many states, in either during the American Revolution itself or in the decades that followed, many states in the North, they banned or abolished slavery within their territories. For example, in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 abolished slavery in Massachusetts. Now, there had never really been that many slaves in Massachusetts in the first place. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed a law that said that all children born to slaves would be free. In 1784, Rhode Island passed a similar law, which basically stated that from this point onward, all children born to slaves were to be free. One of the last northern states to pass such a law was New York. In 1799, New York passed a law that said that from this point onward, all children born to slaves were to be free. But in New York, it wouldn't be till 1827 or after 1827 that slavery would be banished. So as a result of the American Revolutionary War, and because of the belief in Republican ideology and the equality of men, slavery came to be non-existent in the North. Now, in the North, slavery had never really been much that important in the economy. But in the southern states, from, let's say, Delaware and the Chesapeake region, Maryland, and down south, especially in states like South Carolina and Virginia, slavery was probably the most important institution in the Southern economy. You had plantations, tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region of the North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland, and then you had mainly cotton, not cotton quite yet, but rice and indigo in the coastal Carolina region and into Georgia. And in South Carolina and Georgia, slaves made close to half the population of those states. So freeing slaves was just not an option in the South. In fact, during the American Revolutionary War, slaves in the South tended to be freed not by Americans but by the British Army. To punish slave owners who supported independence, the British armies in the South often freed slaves. And we see that these freed slaves were even drafted or voluntarily joined the British Army or the Tory militia and supported the British in this war. After the war, the British brought many of the freed slaves. Some of them were settled in Nova Scotia and Canada. Others were settled in Bahamas or in Jamaica and the Caribbean. In fact, by the close of the 18th century, they'd taken some of these freed slaves and settled them back in Africa, along the west coast of Africa in what is today Sierra Leone. So more slaves were freed because of the actions of the British than by the Americans in the South. It was just not an option in the South to free the slaves as it had been in the North. Now, the issue of slavery was a very touchy issue, and because it was just not an option for the Southerners to liberate their slaves, as had been the case in the North. And in fact, at the Constitutional Convention when it met in Philadelphia in 1787, and when they drafted the Constitution, they didn't even put the word slave or slavery into the Constitution, even though it's in the Constitution. For example, under Article 1 of the United States Constitution, when they added up population to determine the number of representatives from each state in the House of Representatives, they referred to free persons, and then they referred to other persons, and that other persons would be counted as 3/5 of a person. So they didn't refer to slaves, they just referred to them in the Constitution as other persons. Now, another touchy issue in the Constitutional Convention was the slave trade. Many Northerners wanted to ban the slave trade, to stop the importation of slaves from Africa, but that was something that Southerners, needing slaves for their economy, did not want. So a compromise was reached that said that Congress would not act to ban the slave trade until the year 1808, and that was put into the Constitution. Again, they didn't refer to slaves. They said that the importation of persons would not be prohibited until 1808. So slavery was a very touchy issue, even in the late 18th century. But nonetheless, many leaders, even in the South, believed, at least in the late 18th into the early 19th century, believed that slavery was a necessary evil. They didn't necessarily believe that it was good, but they believed that it was necessary for the economic stability of the South. And many leading Southerners who were slave owners, men like James Madison, President James Monroe, from Kentucky, you had Henry Clay. Many of these people believed that the best way to deal with slavery was for slave owners to voluntarily free their slaves, to emancipate them. That's where we get the word emancipation. And in their will, to let them go free. And this was a consensus throughout the nation that this was the best way to deal with slavery. One of the promoters of emancipation was an activist by the name of Benjamin Lundy. Here he is. Benjamin Lundy was from New Jersey. He was a Quaker. As a Quaker, he believed in the equality of all people before God. He came from a working class family. His parents were saddle makers. He was a saddle maker by trade, but he decided to become an activist to try to encourage slave owners to voluntarily emancipate their slaves. And with this in mind, in 1822, he founded a newspaper called the Genius of Universal Emancipation. And he went down south to publish his paper. He published the paper first in Tennessee in 1823. So that the idea being that he wanted Southerners who owned slaves to read his newspaper and be persuaded by its arguments to free their slaves. He also, in 1824, he moved the paper to Baltimore, Maryland, being another slave state. Now, many people, especially in the South, many supporters of emancipation, believed that the freed slaves needed to be moved out of America. They came to believe that that freed slaves could not live at peace with their former masters. And so many supporters of gradual emancipation were also believers in the colonization movement. The colonization meant taking freed slaves and moving them back to Africa. Now, one of the reasons why there was this belief that freed slaves and their former masters, could not live in peace was the events of the Haiti Revolution. In Haiti, in 1791, Haiti in the Caribbean was a colony of France, and it was the vast majority of its population were slaves from Africa, and they worked under very difficult conditions to raise sugar. In 1791, there was a massive slave revolt, and this was going on at a time when France was in the midst of its French Revolution. And the slaves rose up, and eventually, after many years of violent war, they won their independence and became an independent republic in 1802. Now, this war between France and the slaves of Haiti was marked by massacres and gruesome deaths. And when slave owners heard about Haiti, they were a little afraid. They were afraid that if the slaves were free in America, that similar scenes might play out, where you would have massacres and mutilation and killing, like all the gruesome tales they heard coming out of Haiti. So that's why many leading Southerners who were also slave owners, they supported emancipation, but they also believed in colonization, the idea of taking these freed slaves and moving and settling them back in Africa. Now, with this, and people like many leading Southerners, James Madison, James Monroe, Henry Clay of Kentucky, many leading Southerners who were slave owners supported colonization. With this in mind, the American Colonization Society was founded in 1817 with the idea of moving these slaves back to Africa. Now, they actually got the idea from the British. The British had moved many of their freed slaves to Sierra Leone on the coast of West Africa. And the American Colonization Society had a similar idea. In 1821 and 1822, the American Colonization Society went to West Africa, and they purchased land from some African chiefs in the region, and they called this area Liberia. And Liberia was to be a place where former slaves could find a new home, and slave owners who supported colonization provided funding so that their freed slaves could move to Liberia and start new lives. In fact, when Liberia was founded in 1822, its capital was named Monrovia, in honor of James Monroe, the President of the United States at the time. Eventually, Liberia would become an independent republic in 1847, when the American Colonization Society allowed the region to be run by the slaves, the freedmen themselves. But the Liberia and colonization never really caught on. Between its founding in 1822 and the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1816, only around 15,000 freed slaves made their way across the Atlantic to settle in Liberia, and that was just a very tiny fraction of the millions of slaves in the South and in America. Eventually, though, there was a shift. By late 1820s into 1830s, it became clear that for people who were opposed to slavery, that gradual emancipation was not enough. That gradual emancipation was not going to get the job done and end slavery. So that begs the question, why? Why did all of a sudden people opposed to slavery think that it was the best thing to do at this point was just to take strong action and to abolish slavery altogether? So what were those causes? One of the main causes was the fact that it became increasingly clear by the 19th century, let's say by the 1820s and 1830s, that Southerners, instead of seeing slavery as a necessary evil, that Southerners were actually seeing slavery as a positive good. By the time you get to the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, prominent Southerners were arguing that slavery was a beneficial institution, that Africans by nature were servile, and the best thing for them was to be slaves, that they were incapable of being free men, that slavery was a blessing to Southerners because, not to Southerners, it was a blessing to slaves because it allowed them to be exposed to Christianity and to higher culture, the higher culture of white civilization. So all of a sudden you had Southerners defending and being very protective of the institution of slavery. And probably the major reason for that major shift in Southern attitudes was the fact that slavery became an even more important part of the economy of the South because of the growth of cotton production. With Eli Whitney's discovery of the cotton gin and with the growth of cloth mills in Europe and America, there was a tremendous demand for American cotton. And as people moved out west into the Tennessee Valley of Alabama, into the Mississippi Valley, they brought their slaves with them and raised cotton. In fact, the region of the Tennessee Valley that goes to Alabama was called the Black Belt because there were so many slaves and so many cotton plantations developed along the very fertile Tennessee Valley in Alabama. And also in Mississippi. Mississippi became a major cotton growing area because along the Mississippi River was prime agricultural land for raising cotton. So cotton was incredibly profitable. In fact, by the time you get to the mid-19th century, about 2/3 of America's richest men were plantation owners raising cotton. So it was a very incredibly profitable enterprise, and slavery made cotton growing very profitable. So slave owners, of course, were very defensive and wanted to maintain and protect their institution. You can see this change of attitudes exemplified in somebody like John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina. He was first elected to Congress in 1810 as one of the war hawks. And early in his career, he was a supporter of Henry Clay and he really believed that the South could become an industrial commercial area and supported tariffs and supported internal improvements. This would be early on in his career, let's say before 1820. But as cotton became more important to the economy of South Carolina and to the economy of the South, all of a sudden John C. Calhoun shifted his position. And by the time you get to the late 1820s and 1830s, he was a firm defender of the institution of slavery, one of its strongest advocates, and a big believer and opposed to tariffs and a big supporter of the institution and states' rights. And so John C. Calhoun just within his lifetime changed his positions on public policy based on the fact this tremendous change in the economy and the importance of cotton production and slavery to the Southern economy. So as Southerners became more protective of the institution of slavery and as their attitudes changed, people who were opposed to slavery and believed that slavery was wrong, they also came to the conclusion that it would be impossible to persuade these Southerners to voluntarily give up their slaves. So it would be necessary just to outright abolish slavery right there and then. Actually, abolitionists in the North, in America, probably were motivated by the fact that the British government abolished slavery. In 1832, you had elections in Parliament in Great Britain that resulted in a very liberal government, and the government in 1833 of Great Britain abolished slavery in all of its territories. So that meant that slaves in the Bahamas and Bermuda and in South Africa, these slaves who were part of the wider British Empire were guaranteed their freedom. Now, they didn't automatically give them their freedom. In some cases, they had to wait a while, or there was a period where they had to, a transitional period. But the British government had taken action to abolish slavery. And also the British Navy took it upon itself to stop the slave trade and to patrol the coast of Africa to stop what they considered illegal slave trading. Abolitionists in America could be heartened and motivated by what they saw going on overseas. Now, another factor for the support for abolition in America was the fact that African Americans did not support gradual emancipation or colonization. African Americans their leaders became more and more convinced and supported the idea that the only real solution to the problem of slavery was immediate abolition. And this was the case among the growing numbers of free blacks that lived in the North. Now, leading the charge for abolition among African Americans was the church, was the African American churches that had arisen. Now, many of these churches dated back to the First Great Awakening, and they continued to grow and prosper. And in the African American communities, the church leaders, the ministers, were often leaders. Now, the Second Great Awakening, just as it affected all of Americans, it affected African Americans too. And there was a burst of religious enthusiasm among African Americans, as there was among the general American population. Now, the slave owners and pro-slavery advocates had argued that one of the benefits of slavery was it exposed and converted Africans to Christianity. And pro-slavery advocates would point to passages in the Bible and the New Testament or like the existence of slavery among the patriarchs in the Old Testament, and the fact that St. Paul in his letters on more than one occasion tells slaves that they should obey their masters. He also tells people that they should obey their government, and women should obey their husbands, and that was just the order of things. But African American ministers and African American Christians, they also read the same Bible, but they focused in on parts of the Bible that talked about freedom and liberation. For example, in the story of Exodus, where the slaves, the Israelite slaves, are by the acts of God are freed, and God redeems them from slavery and brings them to the land of milk and honey, the land of Canaan. African American Christian leaders looked to passages in St. Paul, the same guy, the same apostle who wrote about slaves obeying masters. St. Paul also talked about how people who were in a state of sin were enslaved to Satan, were enslaved to sin, and that Jesus came to liberate people from that slavery. So that language of liberation was used in the New Testament, and African American ministers could read those passages and feel a sense that just as Christianity freed people from the slavery of sin and death, that it also could free, that all men should be free. And so those passages from the Bible really inspired African American ministers to seek the end of slavery as an evil institution that kept people enslaved, that mistreated African Americans, that needed to be immediately abolished. As early as 1827, a group of ministers of African American churches in New York City, as early as 1827, they published a newspaper called Freedom's Journal. It was only published for 2 years, or 3 years, from 1827 to 1829, but it was a newspaper devoted to the idea of abolition. In 1829, a free black from Boston named David Walker, he published a pamphlet called Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And it was a pamphlet which basically said that slavery was a terrible sin, and it warned white Americans, using biblical language, that unless they exterminated this terrible sin and ended this terrible sin, that the wrath of God would be upon them. And it pointed out that God had punished Pharaoh for enslaving the Israelites. It pointed out Sodom and Gomorrah had been destroyed because of their many sins. It pointed out that the Roman Empire had fallen. It had been the Roman Empire that had crucified Christ. And so he used that biblical language to give a very spirited attack on the institution of slavery and calling for its immediate abolition. It should also be noted that the Great Slave Rebellion in Virginia, led by Nat Turner. Nat Turner led this great rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Nat Turner was a minister. He was an ordained Baptist minister, a leader among the slaves in Virginia, who was a preacher. We are told that he even baptized a white man at one point. So white people were coming to hear him preach. And Nat Turner came to believe that God was calling upon him to liberate the slaves. And he led one of the largest slave insurrection in American history in 1831. So it was the African Americans who were taking the lead and calling for the end of slavery, that slavery was a sin, that slavery was wrong, and that it needed to be immediately abolished. Now, some white Americans This is the period of the Second Great Awakening when there was this religious fervor, and many white Americans were in agreement with David Walker. They believed that slavery was a terrible sin, that slavery was a social evil, that unless America ended slavery, America was doomed. And one such man was William Lloyd Garrison. There he is. William Lloyd Garrison had previously been a supporter of Benjamin Lundy, and they had worked together. But over the course of the 1820s, William Lloyd Garrison became convinced that it would be impossible to persuade slave owners to voluntarily liberate and emancipate their slaves. So he became a firm believer in abolition. And in 1831, he published the first white-owned, anyway, abolitionist newspaper called the Liberator. And then this came out in 1831, and it had a very powerful impact across the country. And it rallied people behind the cause of the immediate abolition of slavery. Because of the activism of William Lloyd Garrison, more and more people came around to the cause of abolition. Two such men were the brothers Arthur and Louis Tappan of New York City. They were wealthy merchants, and they had a lot of money to bankroll movements. So they joined with Garrison in this idea of working to abolish slavery. Now, this being the age of the antebellum reform, it was decided that they needed to organize a voluntary society. In 1833, in New York City, groups from around the North came together and organized the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, whose sole purpose was to work for the immediate abolition of slavery. Now, William Lloyd Garrison, he held the view that slavery was such a sin that the United States Constitution was basically, as his view, was an invalid document. He believed that he even referred to the United States Constitution as a covenant with death. He became known as a disunionist, William Lloyd Garrison, because he believed that the free states ought to secede from the Union and just break away from the slave-owning states. Now, and in fact, William Lloyd Garrison refused to pay taxes because he believed that the government, but because it sanctioned slavery, the government was unjust. There were some abolitionists who even took it farther. They were pacifist anarchists, and they believed in nonviolence, but they also believed that the government that sanctioned slavery was invalid and lacked all credibility and authority, so they took the position that they would not obey any of the laws of such a government. Now, not all abolitionists were on the same page. And some abolitionists believed that they ought to work within the political system, work through the government to push for the abolition of slavery. One such man was James Burney, and like-minded people. In 1840, they decided that they were going to organize a political party, and whose goal was to work for the abolition of slavery. So in 1840, delegates from around the North met in Albany, New York, and at this convention they created the Liberty Party. And the Liberty Party was a third party. You had the Whigs and the Democrats, but it was a third political party. It never really grew. It never really had much strong support. James Burney ran for president in 1840 and 1844. In the 1844 election, he was able to garner about 60,000 votes. But the Liberty Party never won a single state or had much success. But nonetheless, they continued to run presidential candidates all the way up until the 1860 election. Some abolitionists believed that they could work within the system to try to end slavery. Now, many of the abolitionists were whites. In fact, the vast majority of the leadership in the American Anti-Slavery Society were whites. And ironically, many of the abolitionists, even though they are opposed to slavery, many abolitionists held what we would consider racist views, in the sense that they believed in the superiority of whites racially over blacks. But nonetheless, there were some black participation in the American Anti-Slavery Society and in the abolitionist movement. And one such person who played a very prominent role in opposing slavery was the African-American Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. He was born in Maryland. Now, he escaped slavery as a young man and settled up north. And eventually in 1845, he published a book. It was a self-autobiography. It was called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And in this book, he told about his own personal experiences with the institution of slavery. It was a very powerful book, and it's considered one of the great classics in American literature. And now Frederick Douglass came to believe that slavery was not going to be abolished without violence. That, in fact, in 1847, as early as 1847, he, in a discussion with the abolitionist John Brown, he agreed with John Brown that maybe a slave rebellion, a massive slave rebellion in the South would be the only way to end the institution of slavery. In fact, in 1859, when John Brown was planning his Harper's Ferry plan, he asked Frederick Douglass to join him, and Frederick Douglass thought the plan was foolhardy and refused to join him. But nonetheless, he feared that he might face some questioning after the Harper's Ferry incident involving Brown, that after the Harper's Ferry incident occurred, he fled to Canada and then moved to Great Britain for several years and came back after the Civil War had begun, came back to America. Frederick Douglass was not the only African American deeply involved in speaking out against slavery and trying to gather support for abolition. Another important African American leader was Sojourner Truth, was born into slavery. She was born in 1797, so she was born in New York State. So she was born before they passed a law that said that all children born in New York were to be free. So she did not win her freedom until 1828. Now, in 1843, she had a religious experience, and she believed that God was calling upon her to spread the word about the evils of slavery. And she changed her name, and Sojourner Truth was not her birth name. Sojourner means traveler. Truth meant she was going to travel around and spread the truth of the evils of slavery. And she became very active in speaking, especially to women, about the terrors and evil of the institution of slavery. Now, another area where you see both African Americans and whites involved in opposing slavery is the work of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes that allowed slaves to escape slavery in the South and get their way through the North and get their way to Canada. Remember, in Great Britain had abolished slavery. So once there was no slavery had been abolished in Canada, that would be a place where runaway slaves could go and live in freedom. And the Underground Railroad, one of the official leaders was a Quaker named Levi Coffin, who was from North Carolina and who had moved to Cincinnati and was important in spearheading and developing these various routes. One of the routes went right through Cincinnati, Ohio. And one person who stands out in the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a woman who had been a slave at one point, and she found her freedom, but she became very actively involved in the Underground Railroad. In fact, in the 1850s, she went into the South, deep into the South, on 19 different occasions to help slaves escape and find their way to freedom in Canada. So many African Americans were involved in free African Americans, and runaway slaves were involved in the Underground Railroad. Many activists were as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who we'll talk about later, was involved. Her family was involved in the Underground Railroad. John Brown, the leader of Harper's Ferry, was involved in the Underground Railroad. Many leading abolitionists were involved in this activity.